The reading sat at the very edge of the red zone, just barely touching it. In any other context, a test environment, a training simulation, a safety audit, it would have been impossible to ignore. But on that day, at that facility, it was just another number on a screen. Another piece of data in a sea of flashing lights and routine noise. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked the obvious question. The operator who saw it first glanced at his supervisor. The supervisor was on the phone, talking about production targets. The operator looked back at the screen. Then he looked away. And within the hour, the entire unit would be gone. Not because of a single catastrophic failure, but because of a dozen small ones. Each one visible. Each one ignored. What you're about to see isn't a rare event. It's not a freak accident or a once-in-a-century disaster. It's a pattern. A predictable, well-documented pattern that plays out in refineries, on construction sites, in warehouses, and even in hospital operating rooms, every single day. The details change, the industry changes, but the structure is always the same. It starts small, a gauge that reads 3% above normal, but it's probably nothing. A valve that doesn't seal quite right, but it's been like that for months, and nobody's complained. A worker who notices something strange, but doesn't want to seem difficult. A shortcut that saves 5 minutes, and nobody gets hurt. So it becomes the new normal. Alone, none of these signs mean much. Any single one of them could be explained away. Instrument drift, routine wear, a tired employee, human error. But together, they form a countdown, a chain of small failures that lines up perfectly. This pattern isn't tied to one industry or one failure. The signals show up early, but most systems aren't designed to recognize or act on them. In this case, the clock ran out. The investigation that followed would take 18 months. It would cost millions of dollars, and the final report would be over 400 pages long. But the first page said something simple. 3 words. This was preventable. 24 hours before the incident, the facility was running a routine startup, a procedure they'd done 100 times before. Everyone knew the steps. Everyone trusted the systems. That trust was the first mistake. Investigators would later discover that critical alarms had been disabled months earlier. Not because they were broken, not because someone was careless, but because they were inconvenient. They triggered too often. They slowed down production. So someone made a call. Someone in a position of authority said, "Turn them off." It wasn't malicious. It wasn't sabotage. It was efficiency, cost-cutting, optimization, all the words that sound good in a quarterly earnings report. But that one decision created a blind spot, a hole in the facility's ability to see what was coming, and no one in the control room knew it existed. That's how most disasters begin. Not with a bang, not with a villain, but with a quiet decision that seems reasonable at the time. A decision made by someone who will never work the night shift. Someone who will never stand in front of a gauge that's screaming for attention. Meanwhile, on the floor, the workers noticed things. Small things. A valve that felt different. A reading that didn't match yesterday's log. A vibration that wasn't there before. But they didn't say anything. Because saying something rarely changes anything. When the startup began the next morning, the readings started climbing. Slowly at first, a few points above normal. Then faster. The temperature rose. The pressure built. The flow rate increased beyond what the pumps were rated for. But inside the control room, the screens showed numbers that were technically within range. What the operators didn't know was that their instruments were lying. A critical level indicator had failed hours earlier. It was stuck at 60%, but the actual level was already past 90 and climbing. One operator noticed something strange. The numbers weren't moving the way they should. The flow rate and the pressure weren't matching the pump speed. He mentioned it to a colleague, just a casual comment. "Hey, this looks a little off." The colleague said, "Probably a sensor glitch. Happens all the time." That was 51 minutes before the incident, the first real warning. The flow rate had changed. More material was leaving the unit than was entering it. That imbalance is physically impossible under normal conditions. It should have triggered an immediate shutdown. Every engineering textbook says so. But the alarm didn't sound. The light didn't flash, because the system they trusted to warn them had already been silenced. Months ago, by a decision made in a conference room, by someone who would never see the gauge that was about to hit red. The operator who noticed the imbalance raised his hand. He said, "Should we slow down?" His supervisor looked at the production schedule. They were already behind. He said, "Keep going. We'll check it after the shift." At 41 minutes, they shut down the main pump. Under normal circumstances, the flow should have stopped. The pressure should have dropped. The temperature should have stabilized. But nothing changed. The pump was off, but the material kept moving. Because the system had already lost control. The imbalance was too great, the pressure was too high, and there was no alarm to tell anyone how bad it had become. At 18 minutes, pressure readings began climbing toward a critical threshold. Not slowly anymore. Fast. The crew tried to intervene. They opened valves. They called the control room. They did everything they were trained to do. But by then, it was too late. The chain had already broken. What happened next took less than a second. A vapor cloud formed. It found an ignition source. A hot surface. A spark. Nobody ever knew for sure. And the facility detonated. 15 people didn't come home that night. Hundreds more were injured. The blast was felt miles away. Windows shattered in nearby homes. And in the control room, the screens went black. No more numbers. No more alarms. Just silence. In the weeks that followed, investigators sifted through the wreckage. They interviewed survivors. They pulled data from destroyed control systems. They reconstructed the final minutes, second by second. And what they found was devastating. The company had produced multiple internal safety reports in the years leading up to the incident. Each one warned of rising risks. Each one identified the same deficiencies: alarm fatigue, inadequate training, a culture of production over protection. The same words, year after year. But those reports sat on desks. They were reviewed, acknowledged, and filed away. Because fixing the problems would have meant slowing down. Slowing down would have meant losing money. Losing money would have meant difficult conversations with shareholders. So nothing changed. The warnings were normalized. The alarms were ignored. The people who might have spoken up learned to stay quiet, not because they didn't care, but because speaking up had never changed anything before. Why would this time be different? The issue isn't a lack of information. It's the gap between what's known and what actually gets acted on. That's the quiet tragedy of incidents like this. Not the explosion, not the fire, but the moment, weeks or months earlier, when someone saw something, said nothing, and then forgot they ever saw it at all. Here's what most investigations get wrong. They look for a single failure, one broken part, one bad decision, one person to blame. But incidents like this don't happen because of one thing. They happen because a chain of small failures lines up perfectly. A chain that took months or years to build. The warning signs were there. They're always there. The question isn't whether the signals exist. The question is whether we choose to see them, whether we choose to act on them, whether we choose to listen to the person who says something is wrong, even when we're behind schedule. Before the next incident, and there will be a next incident, somewhere, someday, ask yourself this: what reading are you ignoring right now? What alarm has been silent for so long that you stopped listening? What has someone tried to tell you that you didn't want to hear? The signal is almost never invisible. It's just uncomfortable to look at. Across different environments, the pattern is consistent. The warning is usually there early. The failure is in whether it's recognized and acted on. Don't let it happen again.